She sat there in that little county diner, staring down at her blood pressure pills, her hands shaking because she couldn't afford them anymore. Just a few feet behind her, a quiet Vietnam veteran stood up from his stool and offered to pay with his own hard-earned cash before anyone else even breathed. The room froze. Every conversation stopped. And in that moment, the true meaning of American honor stood taller than any flagpole out front. If you believe stories like this still matter, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to remember what integrity looks like. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. It was a cold, rural Midwest morning, the kind where the air outside still holds that sharp bite of leftover winter, even though the calendar insists that warmer days aren't too far ahead. And inside Pine Grove Diner, everything felt quieter than usual. The wood-paneled walls seemed to hold memories of decades of farmers, truck drivers, church ladies, and veterans who'd sat at those stools before dawn, trying to wake life into their bones with strong diner coffee. Ceramic cups clinked gently, silverware tapped softly, and every sound seemed amplified because there wasn't much conversation to drown it out. Pine Grove always felt like a place where life paused for a moment before the world began demanding things again. And it was in that stillness that this story begins. Evelyn Carter sat alone near the far right of the counter, shoulders slightly hunched, her purse resting gently in her lap, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that often seemed too loud and too fast for her. She was an elderly widow living on a fixed income, but she still carried that quiet grace that older generations seemed to possess naturally. A kind of gentle resilience that wasn't loud, wasn't proud, but had been built through years of doing the best you can with what little you have. Her gaze lingered occasionally toward the small pharmacy shelf attached to the diner's service counter, a peculiar Midwest convenience that allowed locals to refill basic OTC medications when the main pharmacy was closed. Today, that shelf wasn't just a shelf. Today, it represented an emotional crossroads she didn't want to face. Her late husband's memory lived with her everywhere she went. She still wore her wedding band, not because she forgot he was gone, but because that covenant still meant something to her. In a time where many people move on fast, she didn't believe love had an expiration date. She still talked to him sometimes in her mind, especially on mornings like this, when she felt a little fragile, a little tired, and a little defeated by the numbers in her checkbook. These pills weren't a luxury, they were her lifeline, but she had been cutting corners all month, trying to push every dollar just a little further. And now the time had come where she wasn't sure she had enough left to buy them. Several stools down sat Frank Dawson, a quiet Vietnam veteran who had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but still somehow carried weight. His hands were wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, fingers weathered not just by age, but by memories most men never have to carry. Frank didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He was content with silence, content with coffee, and content with sitting in a familiar place where he didn't feel judged, analyzed, or misunderstood. He was just another American man trying to get through another day, one cup at a time. Morning sunlight filtered through the diner windows, streaks of cold white-blue light cutting across the counter surface and landing on plates of hash browns and biscuits and gravy. It was the kind of light that felt almost sacred, soft enough to be comforting, bright enough to remind everyone that the world had already begun turning. People came in and out, wiping their feet, nodding to familiar faces, doing what small-town folks do, living their ordinary lives with quiet repetition. Nobody knew that in just a few minutes, something would happen in this room that would become a story retold for months. From the outside, it would have looked like just another Tuesday. But inside, a moral crossroads was forming, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that does not warn you beforehand. Evelyn sat there gathering her courage, aware that today might be one of those days where she would have to swallow her pride and face the uncomfortable truth of not having enough. And Frank sat there not knowing that he would soon be called upon, not by words, not by duty, but by the quiet voice inside a man who understands what dignity means and what it costs when it's taken away. Most people underestimate how painful small humiliations can be, because they're not loud. They're not dramatic. They don't look tragic enough to call attention. But those humiliations, the ones where you know people can hear you, where strangers' eyes turn toward you, where you feel yourself shrinking inside your own skin, those can be heavier than almost anything. Evelyn prayed silently that she wouldn't have to experience one of those today. She prayed that her money would be just enough. She prayed she wouldn't have to be embarrassed. Frank stared into his coffee like men do who have seen both the world's cruelty and its beauty. And they're trying to hold both truths at once without letting either one break them. He didn't know Evelyn. He didn't know her story. He didn't know her pain. But he did know what it sounds like when a human spirit trembles. And that kind of sound can often be heard even if not a single word is spoken. Veterans see things differently. When people around them look away from discomfort, they look directly at it. They have learned that dignity matters even when no one else notices. On this morning, this simple, quiet, unremarkable diner morning, two stories were about to intersect. One story was a woman trying her best to survive another month. The other was a man who had already survived things the average American couldn't even imagine. They didn't know each other's names. They didn't know each other's history. Yet their lives were about to be tied together by one moment, where the universe calls one person to respond to another person's suffering. And no one, not a single person in that diner, knew that in the next few minutes, a test of American character would arise right there at the counter, disguised as a routine purchase. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be heroic in the Hollywood sense. But it would be a moment where honor stands face to face with humiliation. And one decision, made quietly, without fanfare, would ripple through an entire community. When Evelyn finally gathered the courage to stand, she did it slowly, the way older folks move when their bodies ache but they refuse to let the world see them struggling. She reached for her purse, took a small breath, and walked those few steps to the mini pharmacy shelf as if each step carried the weight of an entire month's burden. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them by gripping the counter edge. She could already feel her throat tightening, the way it does when you know there's a chance you might not be able to afford the thing you need most. Every movement felt fragile and deliberate. The small pharmacy section inside Pine Grove Diner wasn't fancy. Just a wooden shelf with a few rows of common medications, cough syrup, ointments, vitamins, and basic OTC blood pressure refills for when the main pharmacy across the square wasn't open yet. Most people walked by it without thinking, but for people like Evelyn, people who lived life on margins that were thin and unforgiving, that shelf was sometimes the difference between getting their medication today or waiting until someone could drive them to town later in the week. She quietly reached out and picked up the generic bottle her doctor recommended, her fingers curling around it like she was afraid it might slip away. She looked at the tiny price tag on the bottom corner of the bottle, and her heart sank. It was exactly as she feared. The price had climbed again, just a few dollars, but when you're living on limited income, every dollar lost is another dollar taken from something else. She whispered a small prayer, not for a miracle, but for just enough grace to get through this without humiliation. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to keep her composure. She couldn't fall apart here, not in front of people. Across the counter, the faint tapping of spoons against coffee cups continued like normal. A truck driver flipped the page of his newspaper. A retired farmer adjusted his cap and cleared his throat. None of them knew what was happening inside Evelyn's chest, how every heartbeat felt heavy, how every breath felt like it had to be commanded into her lungs. People think small American diners are all warmth and easy conversation, but sometimes they can feel like a stage where you stand alone, feeling like the whole room is waiting to see whether you're going to stumble. She approached the register where Jenny Collins, the cashier and waitress, was wiping down the counter with a soft towel. Jenny smiled politely, the kind of friendly smile that waitresses in small towns wear naturally because they've known half their customers for years. Evelyn placed the bottle on the counter, almost apologetically, like she felt she had to justify her existence, justify her need, justify her own survival. Jenny scanned it without knowing yet that this would be one of those moments she would remember for the rest of her life. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out her small folding wallet. She unfolded crumpled bills she had smoothed and re-smoothed probably 10 times already this morning, and began laying them down on the counter. One bill, another, then some loose coins. She stared at the money, silently counting again, hoping maybe she miscounted earlier, hoping maybe she had enough after all. Hope is a painful thing when you're desperate, because every time you hope, you risk being broken again. Jenny looked at the screen, then at the money, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but a seasoned waitress knows when something's wrong. Evelyn saw it, and she felt the blood drain from her face in that instant, because she already knew the truth. Jenny didn't have to say it. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, willing the world to pause so she could find the strength to hold herself together. She whispered, barely audible, "I don't think I have enough. I might need to put it back." That sentence, that tiny, fragile sentence, was a dagger straight into her own dignity. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply surrendered. She admitted she could not afford her own medication. For a moment, time froze, like everyone in the diner could suddenly feel there was something heavy happening. Something sacred, something too real to interrupt. Evelyn felt her heart contract like a fist had formed around it, because nothing hurts quite like needing something for survival and having to admit in public that you cannot pay for it. She felt eyes on her. Whether they were actually looking or whether it was just her fear imagining it, it didn't matter. Humiliation doesn't require an audience. It only requires the possibility of one. She stared down at the counter, ashamed, shoulders sinking inward. Pride is a strange thing. It doesn't make you arrogant when you're poor. It simply tries to shield you from feeling less than human. Evelyn wanted to disappear in that moment. She wanted to vanish, slip out the door, and pretend this had never happened. And just a few stools away, Frank Dawson heard every single word. He didn't turn his head. He didn't shift in his seat. But inside him, something changed. His chest tightened. His breath slowed. And it was in that quiet second, that precise tiny sliver of time, that the first spark of intervention began forming, in the heart of a man who knows what it means to carry burdens that no one else sees. At the register, Evelyn kept her eyes down as Jenny keyed in the total, and the numbers appeared on the small digital screen, with a soft beep that somehow felt louder than every sound in the building. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, because she already knew before Jenny spoke that the total was higher than what she had in her hand. She tried to smile politely, tried to act normal, tried to pretend that nothing unusual was happening, but her spirit already began to shake on the inside. She looked at her own crumpled bills, laid out flat like they were the last pieces of armor she owned, and her voice, soft as dust, cracked slightly as she whispered that she didn't have enough. Jenny's expression softened in that way only service workers understand, a mixture of compassion, discomfort, and helplessness, because she could feel the moment turning into something painful. She had worked this diner long enough to know when someone was not buying medicine by choice, but by survival necessity, and when someone was short because life simply hadn't been kind to them that month. Evelyn's cheeks flushed red, her embarrassment blooming across her face like a bruise she didn't ask for. She gently pushed the bottle toward Jenny, intending to have it taken off the order. And the worst part was how calmly she tried to do it, like she wanted to make the humiliation easier for everyone else. Evelyn felt her heart compress in her chest the way it does when an elderly person has spent a lifetime being responsible, only to arrive at a place where even responsibility wasn't enough. She wished she could disappear into the floor tiles, wished she could sink into invisibility. Her fingers curled around the edge of her purse, clenching quietly the way people do when they're trying not to fall apart. She swallowed hard, hoping maybe Jenny wouldn't make her say the words out loud. She didn't want anyone to hear her admit she couldn't pay for the medication that kept her alive. People nearby sensed something had shifted, even though the conversation volume in the diner hadn't changed. Forks paused mid-air. The sound of newspaper pages slowed. And although no one turned directly toward her, she could feel the weight of being seen, the weight of being witnessed in a moment she wished had stayed private. Dignity is strange. You don't realize how fragile it is until the moment it breaks. And it doesn't shatter loudly. It crumbles softly, quietly, painfully. Jenny lowered her voice as if to protect Evelyn from the room, even though whispering only made the moment feel more exposed. "Do you want me to put this back?" she asked gently, knowing what the answer would be before she asked it. Evelyn nodded once, barely, as if she was afraid that nodding too firmly would make the humiliation sharper. She tried to smile, tried to act like this was okay, like this wasn't a moment that would stay with her for days. But her lips trembled too much to hold the illusion. Evelyn reached for her purse again, as if she could magically produce more money if she just searched harder, longer, deeper. Maybe she missed a bill. Maybe there was another coin in the corner of the pocket. Maybe somehow she overlooked something. But deep down she already knew there was nothing else left to find. The truth was simple and cruel. She could not afford the one thing she needed most today. And that realization, spoken quietly, hurt more than any loud tragedy. Across the diner, the air felt heavier, like the oxygen level had dropped. Nobody spoke. Nobody interfered. Nobody offered money. The silence became its own character, its own force, the quiet witness to a woman who was losing her dignity in front of people who didn't know her name. Humiliation doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from indifference. And that is often the kind of pain that leaves scars no one else can see. Evelyn whispered the words no one should ever have to say when they're trying to keep themselves alive. "I'll just leave it." Her voice barely existed in that moment, like she was trying to erase her presence, erase the shame, erase herself. She tried to make the moment lighter, to spin it into something trivial, but her eyes betrayed her. They were full of a quiet ache only older people who have lived through decades of hardship can understand. And just a few stools away, Frank Dawson had heard every syllable. That soft, trembling sentence cut into him like a memory he'd forgotten and didn't want to remember. He didn't look up, didn't change posture, didn't break the stillness of his ritual morning coffee. But inside, something had already shifted. Something had already formed in him. Something had already been decided. The humiliation of that moment hung in the room like smoke, a silent plea, a silent wound, and it waited, suspended in the air, to see if anyone in that small diner would stand up against it. Most moments like these go unnoticed, unchallenged, unmet. But this time, someone heard, someone who understood dignity not as an idea, but as a sacred responsibility. Frank Dawson continued staring at the surface of his coffee, but the world behind his eyes had changed. He didn't need to lift his head to know exactly what was happening. He had already heard enough to feel it inside his bones. Soldiers learn to read a room without looking at it. They learn to hear pain without it having to scream. He sat there, weighing silence against action, and inside him, the scales had already begun to shift. His chest tightened in a way that only veterans truly recognize, not as fear, not as anxiety, but as the signal that something moral is happening, and someone must decide whether to let it continue or intervene. People talk about courage as if it's something loud and dramatic. But for men like Frank, courage is quiet, it's deliberate. It's built from decades of choosing to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. And this moment was shaping itself into one of those decisions. He didn't want attention. He never wanted attention. Men who have seen real sacrifice don't crave applause. They crave decency, fairness, and dignity. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He wasn't looking to make a scene. He simply could not sit there and pretend he didn't hear another American's dignity collapsing in front of him. Veterans carry a different understanding of duty. It doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Frank's hand rested on top of his wallet, not moving yet, but ready. He could feel the weight of the decision in his fingertips, The same way he could feel the weight of decisions decades ago in a country far away. He didn't want to stand up. He didn't want to draw eyes. But the moment demanded something. And there comes a point where not acting becomes more painful than acting. The diner stayed frozen in that uncomfortable silence, the kind that makes people look away just to avoid feeling responsible. Forks hovered above plates. Coffee cups remained suspended between table and lips. And Frank could feel how everyone wanted to pretend they hadn't heard what they heard. That's the moment when character is tested, not in crises that make headlines, but in tiny moments no one is supposed to notice. Frank exhaled slowly, the exhale of a man who knows the decision has been made. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He wasn't thinking about recognition. He was thinking about a woman who had just admitted she could not afford to stay healthy, and how unacceptable that reality felt to him. Veterans know what it means to fight, and sometimes the battlefield is a small-town diner, not a foreign jungle. He thought of his own mother once, long ago, and how she'd handle her pride the same way, quietly, humbly, trying not to burden anyone. Pain recognizes pain. Dignity recognizes dignity. And Frank recognized that Evelyn wasn't asking for charity. She was simply trying not to break in public. That was the moment his decision stopped being emotional and became moral. Frank finally shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to loosen his legs. The kind of motion you make when the inner war is over and the outcome is decided. His fingers slid along the side of his mug, releasing it gently. He looked at the counter, not at Evelyn, because looking directly at her would have made her humiliation deeper. True honor protects privacy before it protects anything else. Without a single word spoken, the next steps were already forming in Frank's mind. A silent plan, a silent answer to a silent wound. He was about to stand. He was about to pay. He was about to restore what had been taken. And he would do it so quietly that Evelyn wouldn't even have to lift her eyes. Because dignity is not returned loudly. It is returned gently, carefully, respectfully. And in that exact instant, that thin moment where a thought turns into an action, Frank Dawson became the one person in that diner who refused to let humiliation win. He hadn't moved yet, but the universe inside him already had. He wasn't about to let this woman walk out weaker than she walked in, because honor isn't theoretical. Honor is what you do when a moment like this demands a decision. Frank rose slowly from his stool, steadying himself not because of weakness, but because he wanted every movement to be controlled, respectful, intentional. He didn't look toward Evelyn, because looking at her would turn this moment into pity, and he wanted nothing to resemble pity. He stepped forward with quiet resolve, the way a man steps when his decision has already been sealed. Every step carried decades of service, sacrifice, and a lifetime of knowing what dignity means in the smallest moments. And in that short walk, he accepted responsibility for this woman's burden. He approached the counter with the calm presence of a man who has crossed lines scarier than this one. Who knows that sometimes the battlefield looks like a diner counter instead of a foreign shore? He didn't clear his throat, didn't make a sound to draw attention. He just placed his wallet gently on the counter, like an offering. His eyes never flicked to the room to see who might be watching. None of that mattered. He wasn't here for his reputation. He was here to protect someone else's dignity. Jenny looked at him with a start, eyebrows raised slightly, because she wasn't expecting anyone to step in. Her hand paused over the register. She knew what this gesture meant even before Frank opened his wallet. She could see the intentionality in how he stood. She could see the quiet authority in his posture. And suddenly the moment didn't feel like humiliation anymore. It felt like intervention. Frank slid his card forward without a word, gently pushing it toward Jenny as if it were the most natural action in the world. But his silence spoke louder than any speech. It said, "No one deserves to walk out of here defeated today." He didn't need to embellish his gesture with words. He wasn't trying to be impressive. He was trying to be protective. Evelyn didn't lift her head at first. She didn't even realize what was happening. She assumed Jenny was simply holding the bottle while she collected her things. But then she heard the soft scrape of a card being placed on the countertop, and her heart knew what that sound meant before her mind did. Her breath caught, and she froze, unsure whether she should protest or simply let the mercy be what it was. Jenny looked at Frank again, seeking confirmation, silently asking, "Are you sure?" He responded not with sentences, but with a gentle nod barely visible. It was a nod from a man who had already made peace with the choice. His expression wasn't dramatic. It was steady, calm, and sincere. There was no ego in his face, only responsibility. Evelyn finally lifted her head just enough to see movement in her peripheral vision, and her gut twisted, because she understood instantly what Frank was doing. Humiliation had wrapped itself around her spirit just moments earlier, but now she felt something different rising inside her. Disbelief mixed with relief, and for a foolish half-second she wanted to say, "No, no. You don't have to," but the words wouldn't come out. Her voice didn't work anymore. Frank still didn't look at her, because eye contact would have made this moment about him helping her, and that would have made the humiliation return. Instead, he focused on the register, on the practical mechanics of restoring her dignity. Veterans know how to protect without spotlight. This was his mission now, and he would complete it without making her feel small. Jenny exhaled slowly, almost reverently, because she knew that this wasn't just a transaction. This was a moral event. She picked the card up with a kind of respect usually reserved for sacred things. And she said nothing either, because anything she could have said would have cheapened the holiness of the silence. In that moment, that precise instant, the room shifted. Honor entered the space like warm light breaking through a storm cloud. No speeches, no drama. Just a quiet man deciding that another American's dignity was worth stepping forward for. And with that simple movement, a battle was won without anyone ever raising their voice. Jenny swiped Frank's card with the same kind of careful gentleness one uses when turning the page of a fragile old family Bible, slow, respectful, aware of the weight of what it means. And just as she prepared to finalize the transaction, Frank leaned in slightly and whispered his request. His voice was low, not secretive, but reverent, like he was trying to protect something sacred rather than hide something shameful. He said quietly, carefully, with conviction, "Separate bag." No record tied to her, and those 8 words transformed the moment entirely. This wasn't just payment, it was protection. It wasn't charity, it was dignity. Frank wasn't just covering the cost. He was shielding the identity of the woman he was helping. He was erasing the evidence so she wouldn't have to carry the embarrassment tomorrow. Jenny froze for a split second, the weight of those words landing fully in her understanding. She realized that this wasn't a spontaneous good deed. This was a thoughtful act of moral precision. Frank wasn't rescuing Evelyn, he was restoring her autonomy. He was making sure she walked out of the diner not as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had never been humiliated at all. Around them, the diner went absolutely still. The room seemed to stop breathing. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered mid-air, not because they wanted to stare, but because something holy was happening right there at the counter. People instinctively recognized it, even if they didn't fully understand it. They could feel the shift. They could feel the gravity. No one dared interrupt. Evelyn's tears rose uninvited, not from humiliation anymore, but from relief so deep it almost hurt. Her shoulders softened and her breath steadied for the first time since she reached for that pill bottle. She was not being treated like a charity case. She was being treated like someone whose dignity mattered. And in that moment, she remembered what grace feels like. Jenny nodded slowly, fully committing to Frank's instruction. She bagged the medication in a separate plain brown pharmacy bag with no identifying slip attached. Then she quietly slid it toward Evelyn, gently, as if handing over something far more fragile than a pill bottle. That bag now carried more than medicine. It carried restored dignity. Frank remained still, not puffed up with pride, not seeking gratitude, but grounded and humble, like a man who knows that doing the right thing should never require applause. His face remained neutral, calm, anchored in purpose. He didn't need thanks. He didn't want thanks. His only goal was to ensure that this woman left with her head held high again. The energy in the diner changed. People didn't cheer, didn't clap, didn't speak. Instead, they bore silent witness. Because sometimes silence is the highest form of respect. Evelyn held the bag against her chest, not like merchandise, but like a gift she didn't expect to receive. The weight of humiliation dissolved, and in its place, dignity returned. And in that stillness, in that fragile sliver of time, everyone in that diner learned something they might never forget. That honor doesn't always arrive with medals, or uniform, or fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a man who quietly refuses to let another human being walk out feeling less than whole. And that is what changes everything. Jenny pressed the button to finalize the purchase, and the small electronic beep felt louder than any siren, because it signaled the exact second where humiliation was replaced with mercy. The register drawer slid open with a soft metallic clink, and the receipt printed slowly, almost ceremonially, like it understood that this was no ordinary receipt. Evelyn stood there frozen, hands gently pressed against the counter, trying to make sense of the moment she was living inside. She didn't feel saved. She felt seen. She felt defended, and that subtle difference was everything. Frank didn't shift his weight, didn't adjust his stance, didn't draw attention in any way. But inside, a calm settled into him. A moral battle had been fought and won in silence. He didn't need to glance around for approval. He didn't need to measure reactions. He had done what honor required. To him, this was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply the only choice a man with principles could make. Evelyn stared at the receipt only long enough to realize it bore no trace of her name. No proof, no marking, no connection. And the relief hit her like warm sunlight after a long winter. She had spent so much of her life trying desperately not to burden others, and here stood a man who didn't treat her need like a weight. He treated it like a moment to stand guard over her dignity. That alone made her eyes burn with emotion. Her voice cracked softly as she whispered, "I don't deserve this." But Frank wasn't shaken. He had heard words like that before, in hospital waiting rooms, in bunkhouses, in quiet moments where men questioned whether they deserved to live while others didn't. That same war lived in his memory, and he responded with the truth, the only truth that mattered, spoken gently, spoken evenly, spoken like an oath. "Ma'am, this is about your health." That sentence, simple, unpolished, sincere, was the moment of triumph in this story, because it reframed everything. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This wasn't rescuing a stranger. It was an act of stewardship, one American protecting another American. Evelyn swallowed deeply, trying to steady her breath again. Frank had just returned something to her that money cannot buy. Jenny handed the plain brown bag toward Evelyn with both hands, like one might hand over something sacred. And the older woman accepted it slowly, as if her fingers needed a moment to relearn how to hold something important without trembling. Her eyes lowered again, not in shame, but in reverence. Something inside her had been restored. Not her finances, not her situation, but her dignity. Frank gave no speech, no explanation, no justification. He just stood quietly and waited for Jenny to complete the process. He wasn't a hero in the Hollywood sense. He was something much rarer, a man who understood the spiritual duty of protecting another's value without needing to call attention to himself. That is the kind of hero the Midwest knows well, the kind America used to raise by the thousands. The room still hadn't moved, as if the entire diner was suspended in a bubble of stillness. No one dared break the silence because the moment had weight, holy weight, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood. Some people don't understand reverence, but in that diner, they felt it. The air had shifted. The atmosphere had changed. Evelyn clutched the bag with both hands, holding it close to her chest like it contained not pills, but a renewed sense of human worth. She felt smaller pain dissolve into something like gratitude, not because someone paid for her, but because she wasn't made to feel less than human when she needed help. That difference, that is everything. And in that exact moment, With one swipe of a card and one sentence spoken in gentle truth, humiliation died, and honor replaced it. Frank turned away from the counter without flourish, without hesitation, without waiting to see how anyone reacted. He walked back to his stool just as he had left it, the same steady pace, the same calm posture, the same quiet dignity. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't act like a man who wanted credit. He simply resumed his morning coffee like nothing extraordinary had happened, because to him, honor was ordinary. Or at least it should be. He sat down and lifted his coffee cup the same way he did before. The mug was still warm, still chipped, still his quiet morning ritual. He didn't need to turn and see Evelyn. He didn't need to re-engage. His mission was complete. His conscience was clear. The world could continue spinning without fanfare. Sometimes the most powerful acts are the ones that require no audience to be validated. Evelyn remained still for several seconds, like she was frozen inside the reality she had just witnessed. Then she tucked the bag closer to herself and took a small, steadying breath. There was no humiliation left in her posture. The shame that once weighed her shoulders down had lifted. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. She was free to leave this diner with her head held higher than when she walked in. Jenny quietly cleaned the counter as if she needed something physical to occupy her hands, because emotional moments often leave people unsure where to put their energy. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, more aware. She wasn't just wiping crumbs. She was closing a sacred moment. Her eyes softened every time they passed over Evelyn, like she was witnessing the end of a quiet war. The diner again began to breathe, gently, as if life was returning after a storm cloud had lifted. Coffee spoons resumed tapping, forks lowered to plates again. Newspapers rustled back open. But even though normalcy resumed, the room was not the same. Because everyone who saw this moment, or even sensed it, understood that something profound had just taken place in front of them. Frank didn't need to see their reactions to know the room had changed. Men who served in war zones develop a sixth sense for when atmospheres shift. And this atmosphere had shifted into reverence, not toward him, but toward the idea that honor still lives here. Quiet honor, the kind that doesn't need a stage. The kind that doesn't wait to be asked. The kind that acts before pride destroys a person's spirit. Evelyn looked down at the brown bag again and realized it held more than medication. It held restored value. The pills would help her heart physically, but the moment itself had healed something deeper. She stood straighter, not out of vanity, but because she remembered she was still a person worthy of kindness. That truth matters more than people realize. Frank sipped his coffee again and gazed out the window into the cold Midwest morning. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like he had done something incredible. He felt like he had fulfilled an obligation. One that came not from duty to a government, but from duty to the soul of what it means to be American. Protect the vulnerable. Restore dignity. Stand when no one else does. And as Evelyn quietly prepared to leave, holding her bag, steadying her breath, she knew that she wouldn't carry this moment as humiliation anymore. She would carry it as proof that grace still exists, even in places no one expects. Because sometimes, right in the middle of an ordinary morning in a small-town diner, God sends someone to remind us that honor still walks this earth. And Frank Dawson, without applause, without praise, without recognition, had just reminded an entire room. Later that afternoon, after Evelyn had returned home and placed the small brown bag on her kitchen table with the kind of care someone uses when handling something far more meaningful than a simple medication bottle, her phone rang. Caller ID didn't show a name she recognized, just a local number. She hesitated before answering, because unexpected calls usually carried bad news in her life. But this one carried something entirely different. A gentle male voice introduced himself calmly. "Evelyn, this is Commander Bill Patterson from the American Legion." He spoke with the tone of someone who had delivered many messages in his life, some difficult, some hopeful, and some that carried the weight of gratitude on behalf of other men who had served. He explained that he had been notified, anonymously, that her next 90 days of medication would be covered in full. No forms, no struggle, no follow-up required. It was already taken care of. Evelyn's breath trembled again, but this time the tremble wasn't fear, it was relief. Evelyn sat down at her small kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten meals with her late husband, the same table where she had paid bills for decades, stretching every dollar, and she covered her mouth with her hand as tears formed again. There was something different about this news. It wasn't just a one-time act of kindness. It was continuity. It was stability. It was breathing room. It was 90 days of not having to choose between groceries and health. Commander Patterson said her name gently, like someone who understood how delicate dignity can be in older age. He didn't pry. He didn't make small talk. He didn't hint at who did it. He simply delivered the message, then said one line that landed in her heart like a hymn. A good man wanted you to have peace of mind. Evelyn closed her eyes, and those words echoed through her soul. Peace of mind. Something she hadn't tasted in a long time. It didn't take long for this moment, this humble moment in a quiet diner, to ripple outward through Pine Grove County. Stories in small towns travel differently than in big cities. They don't spread like gossip. They spread like truth carried on front porches, across church fellowship halls, between neighbors talking over fences, and through the whispers of folks who believe the world is still capable of righteousness. And little by little, people heard. Farmers at the feed store nodded to one another, not sharing details, just acknowledging the story with a look that said, yes, that's the America we believe in. Women in the quilting group at the church basement smiled softly and said quiet prayers of gratitude, because one small act had reminded them that kindness still lives in unexpected corners. Truck drivers who stopped in Pine Grove Diner later that week heard the story from Jenny, not in a boastful tone, but in reverence, and they carried the story further down the interstate, like long-haul disciples of decency. Frank Dawson never said a word about it, not to anyone, not even to the commander. He didn't need his name mentioned. He didn't need to be known. That wasn't his purpose. His purpose was to restore something that should have never been taken. And Evelyn, though she never asked for this, now carried a new kind of courage in her chest, a courage not built from pride, but from proof. And somewhere inside all the houses and barns and trucks and pews of Pine Grove County, one unspoken message resonated. Honor still exists here. In the weeks that followed, the story of the widow and the veteran continued to drift across the county like a quiet hymn that refuses to fade. People didn't embellish it. People didn't sensationalize it. They shared it the way you pass along a piece of scripture, humbly, respectfully, with the understanding that it wasn't entertainment. It was testimony. Testimony that reminded the community of something they already believed deep down. This land still produces men of character. Evelyn walked through the grocery store with a different posture now, her steps a little steadier, her chin a little higher, her shoulders no longer bent under the invisible weight of constant fear. She didn't brag. She didn't tell her story seeking sympathy or attention. She simply lived quieter, lighter, freer. Because when dignity is restored, life itself becomes easier to carry. Frank continued to sit at Pine Grove Diner each morning, same stool, same mug, same steady routine. And no one confronted him about what happened, because they already knew he didn't want the attention. People nodded toward him respectfully, but never intruded. Sometimes reverence is silent. It's a space you give a man who has earned it, not with medals or speeches, but with choices made in quiet moments when no one else moved. Church sermons began to echo the theme without naming names. Pastors spoke about protecting the vulnerable, about lifting one another up, about doing what's right when no one is looking. These weren't new teachings. They were reminders of the American values that had always anchored rural communities. Values built on faith, values built on family, values built on honor, values that are timeless, but sometimes need to be seen to be remembered. Old-timers sitting on porch swings in the evenings would mention the moment in passing, not to talk about the veteran or the widow specifically, but to reflect on how a single act of unseen courage can realign the moral compass of an entire county. Because people had been discouraged lately. They had felt the world growing colder, meaner, more self-centered. But this moment, this one small moment, rekindled belief. And Evelyn herself, while she still lived modestly, now carried something money can't purchase. She carried proof that God still works through ordinary people. Proof that angels sometimes wear denim jackets and drink black coffee in diners at dawn. Proof that sometimes the greatest acts are the smallest ones, the ones that never get documented, but change lives forever. When she closed her eyes at night, she didn't replay the humiliation anymore. She replayed the restoration. She replayed the sentence, "Ma'am, this is about your health." And she realized that in that moment, she wasn't just given medicine. She was given back something she had lost, faith that America still raises men like that. And so Pine Grove didn't return to normal after that morning. It became better, softer, stronger, because one man quietly stood up when no one else did. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this, where someone stepped in not for applause, but because it was the right thing to do? Share your story in the comments.